One of the first casualties was the school of young girls. Almost 200 were killed. Where is the liberation in this war? The Secretary of War, 𝗲𝗍 spoke about giving no quarter, no mercy, which is horrific. A civilized country does not talk about war in this sense. The US had progressively invaded countries in the region, probably at the behest of the Israelis. And our criticism should not be restricted to Israel. The Gulf, the Arab world, there's a lot to be criticized there. The conduct of Arab states. The same thing goes for Iran.
There have been commentators who've come on our podcast and even predicted that this war with Iran would happen. And it could lead potentially to World War III. How worried are you about that possibility or eventuality?
If you've always wanted to work with us, good news! We're hiring 2 roles, 2 very different jobs with one thing in common. We want people who give a damn and want to work on cool shit. The first role is a creative producer. If you've ever watched one of our videos, listened to one of our podcasts, or scrolled past one of our posts and thought, the title's wrong. The thumbnail's a bit off. Something about this isn't quite right. This role is for you because you'll work alongside our team to help shape and protect how everything we make looks, sounds, and feels across 𝗪𝗲𝗻, Ministry of Funny, and Folklore. It's a hands-on role, and you'll be in the thick of everything. Reviewing edits, writing copy, managing timelines, and doing whatever it takes to keep our quality kick-ass and on-brand. The second is a growth hacker, specifically for Folklore, our audio service that turns people's personal stories into timeless podcasts. We are looking for someone who's genuinely excited about digital products, obsessed with scaling things, and curious enough to know what's working in consumer retail now, and especially what's coming next. Because we'll need you to level up our website, the customer journey, and lead growth experiments that will bring Folklore to the world. And for both roles, we don't really care how many years of experience you have, but we do care that you have taste and understand our brands, and also be able to execute, and that you're here to make things, not just manage them. So if you're interested, check out the full description at the link in the show notes, or just head on over to ministryoffunny.com. And if any of the roles tickle your fancy, send us your CV and cover letter to contact@ministryoffunny.com. All the details are in the show notes. And now, on to the podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of your thrice weekly podcast where we talk about the hottest news with a touch of what, Terrence?
Good old humor.
Good old humor.
Yeah.
Today's a very special episode where we're talking about something super important that we have touched on, but we haven't really gone deep.
Yeah, we haven't gone deep, and we haven't had someone who's an expert, or at least really understands the region properly to talk about it.
Yeah, right. So we're very excited today to have Professor Syed Farid Alatas, who is an author and also a professor of sociology at NUS and has been since 1992. Welcome, Prof. Farid. And I mean, like what we mentioned, we have spoken about what's happening in the Middle East just from what we see in the news, from the perspectives of 2 Singaporeans trying to understand what's happening. But how have you been keeping track of things been going on, and how are you thinking about what's happening right now in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's good to have the chance to talk about these very important issues that affect everyone, as I think we all understand by now. It affects everyone in the world. I suppose I could say that this issue is both of intellectual or academic concern to me, but at another level, there's also a personal level because my wife is from Iran, and we have family, we have relatives living in Iran who are affected in a very direct way. So the war is like a nightmare, and at a personal level. And we're extremely worried about our relatives and friends. Of course, at another level, it's concerning because of the way it affects all our lives. The economic impact on us, livelihood of people, prices, inflation, supply chains. These are all the issues that everyone is worried about all over the world. And we realize that a conflict in a very far off place, thousands of kilometers from Singapore, from our region, can affect us in very fundamental ways. So it's it's difficult, I think, at all levels.
Yeah.
And there's so many issues that we can discuss in connection with this war. It's not just about Iran. It's not just about Israel. It's about the world order. There's so many topics that emerge from this episode.
I mean, you talk about it as a nightmare, right? But how did it actually feel when it first happened that weekend, when you heard of the attacks happening? Like what was it? A culmination of something that you've always worried about or feared, or was it completely a surprise when you first heard about it?
It wasn't a surprise because the first war happened last year in the summer. Iran and the US were in the middle of negotiations, and Israel attacked Iran. So it had already started, and so when during the second round that started on February 28th, it was something expected, and the feeling was very similar to what we felt last June. That fear. Since October 7th, 2023, you've had more than 2 years of war on Gaza, and we saw the utter destruction to Gaza, destruction of lives and property, and that was horrific. But in the case of Iran, there's a different dimension. There's a personal dimension. You are actually worried for people that you actually know and love. So that makes the nightmare all the more difficult to deal with.
So maybe before we dive into like what you said, the many facets of how this war impacts you, not just on a personal level, but the world, your research. Maybe you can give us a bit more about your background, because we know you have been teaching sociology at NUS since 1992. You've written multiple books about decolonizing education. You've written about the great Muslim philosophers. So maybe can help us understand your interest in not just the Middle East but sociology as a whole.
Well, so I'm a sociologist. It means that I'm interested in relations between groups and the dynamics of groups. When I say groups, I mean any kind of social group. Human beings exist in groups. We don't exist in isolation. Sometimes, we can think of groups at different levels. You've got very small groups, a couple, family, neighborhood, community, an ethnic group, a religious group, a nation state, or transnational groupings, like when you think about, Chinese diaspora, or you think of Palestinian diaspora. These are transnational groups. So that's in general what sociology is about. It's about groups. But I'm interested in, it's very hard to pinpoint what I'm interested in, because, sociology is a broad area and we're interested in different topics, different ideas. So I guess for a long time, I've been interested in how certain groups dominate other groups. And that's related to my interest in decolonization. That we have been, the Europeans started to colonize the rest of the world since 1492, when Christopher Columbus went to America. That was the beginnings of European colonization. So it began with the Portuguese and the Spaniards, and later on followed by the French, the British, the Dutch, and so on. Now, we are used to thinking that colonization was over when Latin American countries began to obtain independence beginning in the 19th century, Asian and African countries in the 20th century. So we talk about being in a post-colonial period, which I think is actually very wrong. We are actually in a neo-colonial period. We're still colonized in a different way. We're not directly ruled by the Americans and by the British and the French and so on. We're not directly ruled by them anymore. But we are still dominated and controlled. And when you look at what is happening in Palestine, when you look what is happening in Iran, a few weeks ago in Venezuela, the threat of the US to move into Cuba and to, as President Trump put it, to take Cuba, all these indicate that we're still living in a kind of colonial era. There's still coloniality. And I think the term neo-colonialism is good because it's a new form of colonialism without direct rule. So this is one of my areas of interest, to study decolonization, how we can truly decolonize both our minds as well as the way we live our lives.
So, I mean, when you say decolonizing minds, I know you've spoken about decolonizing education. Would you say, like when you say, we are still controlled, does it extend to the institutions of academia? So like the universities, everything that, I mean, we both studied in the US, were our minds being colonized? Are the minds of people who just follow the Western education in some way being colonized?
Well, I think it's a little more nuanced than that. First of all, you don't need to go to the US to have your minds colonized. Sometimes you may need to go to the US to decolonize your mind, right? Because there are a great number of sociologists and anthropologists and geographers and people in cultural studies and comparative literature in US universities who are dedicated towards decolonizing the mind. And these would be Americans as well as people who come from other places who live and teach in US institutions. On the other hand, you could have never stepped out of Singapore or Malaysia or any country in Asia or Africa, studied in your own institutions and received a thoroughly colonial type education. So decolonization really is a matter of perspective, and you can be colonized or decolonized anywhere you are.
So what is a colonial education? Maybe you can help us understand what you mean.
Okay, so one way to put it is that a colonial education is a Eurocentric education. It's an education which gives you a Eurocentric bias about the way the world functions, about the way the world is, right? So what do we mean by Eurocentric bias? It means looking at the world through European or let's say Euro-American experiences without realizing it. That means you think you're getting an objective perspective when actually you're getting a biased perspective. Now, an example I always use in class, I mentioned 1492. This is what do you think when you hear the word the year 1492?
I mean, America was like discovered.
Exactly. The discovery of America. Okay? Now, that gives the impression that America was unknown. And it was the first time human beings found America. Like when the first time humans went to the moon. So we can say that this is the first time human beings have gone to the moon. But can we say that 1492 was the first time human beings knew of America? We can't say that because they were already people in America. Unless you are dismissing them as human beings, which in fact did happen among the Europeans. They did dismiss the natives of America as fully human.
Yeah.
So it would be more accurate to speak of the European discovery of America. But instead, we are educated all around the world that was the discovery of America. In other words, the European experience is generalized as a universal experience. That's the problem. When a European experience is generalized as a universal experience, that is what is, to me, that is a core trait of Eurocentrism or colonial knowledge.
I see.
It also leads us to another trait, which is that the voice of the non-European is silenced. Right? So we don't, when you say the discovery of America as if this is the first time humans discovered America, as if there are no humans in America before Columbus went there, you are discounting, you are dismissing as irrelevant the voice of the non-Europeans. Yeah, and in fact, in the 16th century, in the first decades of the 16th century, there were actually debates in Spain about whether the natives of America were human beings.
Oh, really?
Because there was this idea that if they were not human beings, then it was legitimate to enslave them, to treat them as you treat animals, as you treat, in agriculture, you use, cows and bulls, use horses, as labor.
Yeah.
We could do the same thing to Native Americans if they were not humans or they're not fully human. It was justified, and this debate was going on in the church. So it gives you an idea, as to how the Europeans dehumanized non-Europeans as part of the colonial project.
Yeah. I mean, when I hear what you're saying, it does couple colonialism or imperialism with a lot of Eurocentrism, right? But at the same time, we're here in Singapore chatting where, Japan's imperial ambitions were made Singapore a colony once. And now we talk about China as a superpower in the region. And how does that all fit into, talking about Eurocentrism and imperialism? But then we see in Singapore the realities of, Japan and China also having those ambitions.
Yeah. I don't suggest that Europeans were the only colonial power.
Yeah.
Certainly the Japanese did aspire to be a colonial power, and they did colonize some parts of Asia. They were very brutal. All that cannot be denied. So we're not suggesting that the Europeans have a greater propensity to colonial evils, right? But we can say that they have been, since the 15th century, the dominant colonial power. The various European states have collectively shown themselves to be the dominant colonial power, far more dominant than the Japanese. That I think that's the point. So it's not to suggest that in the future there may not be non-European colonial powers who may be as brutal or more brutal than the Europeans.
So I mean, on that note, and your study of groups, especially when bigger groups dominate smaller groups, have you is there anything you have come to conclude, whether that's just human nature? And at any point in time, be it in the past or in the future, the bigger group will always dominate the smaller group. And it's about how to find that balance. Or do you believe that there can be a world where big countries, small countries all live in pure harmony?
Maybe in a parallel universe. I mean,
not in this universe.
You look at the history of this universe, this world.
Yeah.
There's generally never been such a state, right? There's never we've never existed in such a state of peace and harmony. Our history has been characterized by wars, by domination, by empire. So we are continuously in this struggle. I think what makes the modern world a bit different is that we were promised, for example, we were promised by the Europeans that these kinds of things would not happen again. The European Enlightenment, that since the 18th century, 19th century, the Europeans have become enlightened through science and technology. They would be able to order our lives in a rational, scientific manner, harness nature for the good use of humanity, deploy political systems that would allow for freedom, for peace, for all, and so on and so forth. This is the promise of the Enlightenment. But, they have not delivered. None of us have delivered, actually. So when these things happen, when conquests happen, when cruelty, exploitation, economic inequality, poverty, when all these things take place, we feel that we are not living up, and especially the Europeans, the Euro-Americans are not living up to the ideas that they espouse, that they in fact continue to espouse.
So then, just now you mentioned, like, when you hear Trump talking about taking Cuba or Greenland, Russia just invading Ukraine. I mean, for me, I was born in 84, grew up in the 90s, and all this feels like, how is it possible that in this day and age, this is happening? But for you who has studied, the history of groups, history of empires, colonialism, is that something that you're like, there's almost that you're not that surprised that this is happening now? Because it was inevitable.
That's exactly true. I would be surprised if it doesn't happen. The difference is today. When I say today, I mean in these last few years, especially under Trump, America under Trump. The big difference is that the colonial mentality has become very blatant. In terms of what is actually happening, things are not that different from America under Obama or America under Biden. America was just as imperialist, under previous presidents as it is today. What really is different is the rhetoric, is the language. There's open talk along the lines of a more colonial language among the Americans. And a very unsophisticated, to say the least, but if we were to be more critical, a very crass language, is used. For example, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, spoke last month at the Munich Security Conference. And he was reminiscing about the good old days of colonialism. And he was speaking in a very praiseworthy manner about the European colonization of America, without once referring to the mass killing and genocide against Native Americans, which was an outcome of European colonization of America. The Secretary of War, 𝗲𝗍 𝗪𝗍, when in talking about the war on Iran, spoke about giving no quarter, no mercy, which is horrific. A civilized country does not talk about war in this sense. You talk about defending yourself, yes, but not about no quarter, no mercy. President Trump himself, you remember there was that incident a couple of weeks ago when an Iranian Navy ship was sunk
Sri Lanka,
off the coast of Sri Lanka. A reporter asked President Trump why the US did not capture the boat rather than sink it. And he said it was just fun to sink it. So I mean, this is a kind of it's a very barbaric colonial discourse, right? Which is actually very frightening.
Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, the US or Americans, they're not really a monolith either, right? Like, I think their society is very divided now. And in the past, I think I remember the justifications for the Iraq war back in the day were like, they still went to the UN and talked about weapons of mass destruction and everything. But now it seems like that mask is off. What do you think has changed in the past few decades within America that people are so much more open to talking in that manner that you talked about?
I think that's a good point. America is not a monolith. It's very heterogeneous. You have ideas across the spectrum.
Yeah.
From very pro-war, pro-Republican, pro-Christian Zionism, pro-Trump, to all the way to the other end of the spectrum, to the left. And you've always had dissenting voices. You've always had voices, rational, reasonable voices that are critical of U.S. imperialism, critical of coloniality, and so on. That has been there for decades, in fact. I think what has really changed, so many things have been happening, but I think one of the things is that after October 7th, 2023, when a lot of Americans saw the utter destruction of Gaza, the disproportionate response to Hamas attack against Israelis, and when people came around to the idea that what was taking place was a genocide. And people saw this partly because of, to a great extent, because of social media. That changed the mind of many Americans about the idea that the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world. The idea that Israel is a victim rather than a perpetrator. It had changed many people's minds about how to evaluate Israel. So you have people like the journalist and influencer Tucker Carlson, who is on the right and remains on the right, but who's no longer a Trump supporter. And has taken a very critical view towards Israel. I think who appreciates aspects of Muslim civilization and Muslim culture, because he recognizes that he's a devout Christian, but he recognizes that Christians in the Holy Land in Palestine live in peace side by side Muslims, and it's actually Zionists who treat Christians in Palestine or in Israel badly. He's actually been there and interviewed Christian leaders. So he has really, his mind has really opened, and there are many people on the right who, including many influencers, who have come to that way of around to that way of thinking. I think this experiencing, in the last 2 years, what had been happening in Gaza has really changed a lot of people's minds about Israel, and that spills over into their views about Arabs, about Iran, about Iranians, about Islam, about relations between Islam and Christianity, or even there's a lot of discourse in America about how Jews have lived under Islamic rule, over the centuries, and I think they have sort of been able to change their views about whether Muslims are generally anti-Semitic or not.
But do you think it goes both ways? Because I'm also seeing more people saying we finally have a president who is doing what needs to be done. Do you think as much as it makes people look at, Israel a different way, it has also given people to look at Israel as like, oh, they are doing stuff that should have been done a long time ago?
I think that has always been there, but I think what the war on Gaza and the war now on Iran has actually split the so-called MAGA group, Make America Great Again, right? It's actually split them.
Yeah.
So I think his the support for Trump is not as it's not altogether there as it was before these wars started.
Okay. So we've spoken about the what the US is doing, what Israel is doing, but I know you've also spoken publicly about the Islamic leaders and how the Muslim community around the world, in some way, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's tensions, between the Shias and the Sunnis. How do you think that has contributed to what we see in the world today?
We need to be honest in our critique. So we critique the US for its imperialist stance and its practices. We critique Israel for its being a colonial settler state, because it is a colonial settler state. In my view, it is one of the last. It is one of the last bastions of the old style colonialism, where you rule directly, right? They colonized Palestine, and they're ruling Palestine directly, much in the same way that the British ruled over Malaya. So they have to be called out. They have to be critiqued for this. The Europeans have to be critiqued for their role in all of this, in their inactivity. So do the Arabs. The Gulf Arabs, many of the Gulf Arab states, I would say, compromised their sovereignty by allowing, the Americans to have their bases there. They mistakenly thought that they would be protected by the Americans, and I think they have come to the realization that the Americans are not to be trusted, because the Americans seem more intent on protecting Israel than the Gulf Arabs. And even countries that are victims, right now, Iran is a victim, are also should also be criticized, because you may be a victim in one instance, but you also may be a perpetrator in another. So, for example, I think to the extent that Iran supports the Houthis in Yemen, or their support for the brutal regime, the Syrian regime under Assad, these are very problematic, because these are very brutal regimes or brutal groups. The way they have conducted themselves in Syria, in Yemen. So it's very to me very problematic that Iran supports those groups. So I think we have to be fair in the way we criticize, in the way we conduct our critique. To defend Iran from imperialistic attacks from the US and from Israel is not to condone other things that Iran might have done, right? Iran does have problems. There have been, over the decades, and more recently in the last years, many movements among Iranians, that have been critical of their government. The movement known as Zendegi Azadi, which means women, life, freedom. In the last couple of years, that was a very serious movement fighting for freedom. And then before that, in the last couple of decades, I think more than 15 years ago, you had the Green Movement. And more recently, you had protests in Iran, in January. So these are serious issues. So the Iranian government is not angelic. Many of the governments in the region are not angelic, and that includes the Arab governments as well. So we need to be fair in how we we critique.
So, I mean, the interesting thing is that, some people are saying that the US made a miscalculation here, and the early rhetoric was that, it's going to be a quick thing. We're going to go in, decapitate the leadership of Iran, and then regime change will happen and all. But it's proven to be harder than it seems. Like, can you help us understand, especially on the ground in Iran, like what about, Iran as a country or its people that would make it really hard for just, regime change like that to just happen after the leadership is decapitated? Like, is there something special about the people or their mindset or the way they view what the US is doing?
Yeah, there is something, I think a few things that are important to understand about Iran. It's a large country, about 90 million people. It's a very well-educated country. I think in terms of science and technology, they're the most advanced in the region, apart from Israel. But they're certainly much more advanced than the Arab states. They lead in certain areas, obviously, in nuclear physics, in nanotechnology, in some other areas. They do very well in terms of research, in terms of their publications and citations of their publications. A lot of people don't realize that about Iran. And they have very high, extremely high literacy rates. Literacy among women is very high. Women are very well educated. The majority of, in most universities, of students are women, and that includes sciences and engineering. So they're very admirable in that sense. And for more than 20 years, particularly after the US invasion of Iraq, they've been preparing for this, for invasion. Especially since, the US had progressively invaded countries in the region, probably at the behest of the Israelis, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. So they were waiting for this. So they have been preparing in so many ways, in terms of building up their arms, developing ballistic missile capabilities, also consolidating their command structure, their political structure. They worked it out in such a way that you have autonomy at different levels. You have decentralization, so that if the leader is taken out, at any level, the leader is taken out, the structure still continues. There is a system of replenishment of leaders. So I think this was very important. This was not understood at all by the US or by the Israelis.
So just now, like what Terence said about the US not being monolithic, I would imagine Iran is the same. And I would love to hear your perspective, because you have family who are like suffering there, and help us understand a bit more about Iran, because even when you say they have been preparing for this, right? I can't imagine all 90 million, the full population, right? Are you referring to the government? Because there were protests for a reason, right? The citizens themselves feel a certain way that seem to be at odds with the government. So maybe if we just go one level deeper, what else about Iran's society, the people, are different from each other? And what can we understand that maybe we do not understand? Because personally, I've seen people share pictures of what Iran used to look like in the 70s and 80s before the Islamic Revolution. And sometimes I feel, actually, what is going on in Iran? Like when you say they have advanced nanotechnology, I'm surprised by that, because it's hard to find info about Iran that is, you don't even know what to believe. So what else about Iran society? When you say most of the students at universities are women, but then there was also a lot of clamping down on women's rights. So how do those live together?
Yeah, that's true. Like any society, it's a society of contradictions. So women have made a lot of advances since the revolution. At the same time, there are problems. many women in Iran and men as well are against forced veiling, enforcement of the hijab, and for some women, for many women, in fact, they protested against that, and in fact, they have gained some freedoms because now, after so many decades, you see women walking around without hijab in Iran. So there are all these contradictions, and it's not. And perhaps the hijab is a symbol of the movement against enforced hijab is a symbol of a larger resistance against problems that Iranians find with their government. So all these contradictions are there. But despite these contradictions and despite the misgivings that many Iranians have about their government, they are overwhelmingly united in the face of external aggression. I think this is very important. So Iranians are very, whether religious or not, whether supporters of the government or not, they are very nationalist. And they do not tolerate outside interference. Even for those who want their government to change, they want the change to come from themselves, not, for the Americans or the Israelis to intervene and to install a puppet government or a puppet leader. And I think this is very important. The Western media tends to portray the perspective of some Iranians in the diaspora, especially in America, who actually have been cheering on the American and Israeli bombing of Iran.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask, because I see a lot of that. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
But that's a misrepresentation of the Iranian population. The vast majority of Iranians do not feel that way, including those who are decidedly very much against their government.
Yeah. So is it a problem of your neo-colonial mindset?
Is my neo-colonial algorithm it's showing me all this?
Yeah, too much Western media.
Because same thing, when Maduro was captured, we saw videos of people celebrating on the street, and then we found out that was AI generated.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've tried my best to, whenever I see someone saying, yeah, I'm Iranian, to all those who are condemning the war, you have no idea, you have no right to speak. And then they go on to list why they are actually happy that Trump, because only Trump could do it. So then I'm thinking, is that really a widespread sentiment? And sounds like it's not. They tend to be more anomalies.
Yeah.
Yes. I think so. Definitely. Yeah. I mean, and it makes sense. How can you support the bombing of your country when your people are dying? And is it worth going through that, all that destruction of property, of lives, to change your government? I think any rational, reasonable, peace-loving Iranian would not support that. And if they thought that the US was the liberator, I think now it's clear that it is not. One of the first casualties was the school of young girls. Almost 200 girls were killed. So where is the liberation in this war?
I mean, I've seen in interviews where you did say that Iran is the only anti-imperialist country in the region, but at the same time, I hear the other Arab states, they're very angry with Iran for their retaliation and what they've done so far. Why isn't there more support from, or at least from the neighbors and all, about the fact that Iran is trying to stand up to, an imperialist approach from the US and Israel?
We need to make a distinction between the states and their populations.
Okay.
I think there, in countries, in some countries in the region, many people are happy that Iran is standing up to U.S. imperialism and also to the sub-imperialism of Israel. They're happy about that. But I have to qualify that statement. because here sectarianism comes in. So you have people, you do have people who say that Iran is as bad as Israel. Iran is a Shiite state. They are deviant Muslims, or they are outside of the fold of Islam. So we should not support them. Other Sunni Muslims who are against Shiism, they may take the view that, okay, we're against Shiism, but at the same time, it's good that Iran is attacking Israel. Iran is fighting against Israel or standing up to Israel. So there's that view as well. Then you have governments who, for one reason or another, are beholden to the U.S. They want the presence of the U.S. In the region. They are dependent on the U.S., or at least they thought they are dependent on the U.S. for protection, for investments. So they have that stake. And in other words, one could argue that they are on the imperialist side. So they would not support Iran. They're dependent on petrodollars, as the U.S. is. So they need the presence of the U.S. in the region. Yeah.
So has anything about the war and how it has unfolded surprised you? Or what has been the most worrying thing for you?
I think the most worrying thing is the possibility of greater disunity in the region. The fact that the U.S. That Iran has attacked not only the U.S. bases in the Gulf, but also other installations and even civilian areas where they claim that there was a U.S. presence. For example, U.S. soldiers staying in hotels. This has angered a lot of people in the Gulf, especially the governments, and I think it functions to somewhat alienate them from Iran, and it's going to take a long time to repair the relations. But what is more disturbing is that if countries like Turkey, the Gulf states, Egypt come together to form an alliance, to form a pact, to have defense, treaties, and that I think serves to further isolate Iran, and it also serves to potentially perpetuate the imperialist role of America in the region, as opposed to a scenario that I would prefer, that I would think is better for the region, whereby the U.S. stays out and no more bases, and that the region is governed by the states themselves, meaning the Arabs, the Turks, and the Iranians. And I think that would be ideal in terms of establishing peace and security.
But then where does Israel fit into all that?
And then I think there are a lot of benefits from this. First of all, there would be peace. They would regulate, trade, investment, both among themselves as well as to the external world, with the external world. There would be a lot of mutual benefits. For example, I think the region has a lot to benefit from Iranian science and technology. Iran is also a very large market. And with the unity of the region, they can deal with the Israeli problem. And I think the Israeli problem is something that has to be dealt with in a very fair manner. Certainly not wiping Israel off the face of the earth. That should not be the goal. And in fact, that has never been the goal of even the Iranians. The Iranians are often, you've heard the expression, Iran has been accused of saying that Israel should be wiped off the wiped off the map, right? They actually never said that. people keep repeating that phrase without going back to the original phrase, which has been mentioned by Ayatollah Khomeini and others. They actually referred to wiping the Israeli regime from, or removing the Israeli regime from the pages of history. The key term here is regime. They were and are against the colonial apartheid regime, not the state, not the country. In other words, not that Israelis should be, removed from Israel and thrown into the sea. That was never the idea. The idea, even among the Iranians, was that there should be a state that allows Jews, Muslims, and Christians to live in equality. Many progressive Jews themselves believe that. Noam Chomsky himself said that the Israeli regime should be dismantled. The apartheid state should be dismantled. He's not calling for the destruction of Israel in the sense that Israelis should be sent away and the state be left just to Palestinians. So I think these things should be clarified. Whatever it is, Israel cannot continue in the way it exists today, as an apartheid type colonial state. And I think if there's sufficient unity within the region, they would be able to better deal with help Israel-Palestine to arrive at a better state.
But I mean, just looking at I really need to emphasize, right, that whatever solution there is, there should be a nation which allows for absolute equality between Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Whatever the sins of the past colonizers were, whatever atrocities were committed by the early Zionists, after the Second World War, in grabbing land, in dispossessing Palestinians of their land, whatever sins were committed, their descendants should not have to pay for that. That's very important to emphasize. The sins of the ancestors should not mean that rights are taken away, basic human rights are taken away from their descendants. I mean, so I was going to ask, is that too idealistic? Because in the last 5 years or whatever, we've looked at institutions like the UN and seen how ineffective they've been in reining in what Israel is doing, and everything is sort of just pushed aside. I mean, you can declare the leader a war criminal and nothing happens. Are we generations removed from that kind of solution or resolution that you're talking about?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't say it's too idealistic. I think we need to be idealistic. Now, how realistic it is in terms of when this can be achieved is another matter. But if you look at how fast things have accelerated in the last couple of years, one of the effects of the war in Gaza has been a really rapid and fundamental change in world opinion about Israel, about the conduct of Israel. I think people now don't easily fall into the trap of the anti-Semitic trap, that if you criticize Israel, if you criticize Zionism, you are anti-Semitic. A lot of people fail to fall into that trap. And that's a very important development. I think more people are coming around to the idea that there's a distinction between Judaism and Zionism. many people around the world understand that there are many religious Jews, including NGOs and movements devoted to Judaism, but against the Zionist state, against apartheid. I think these are very important religions developments, and they make for alliances between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, as far as the religious sector is concerned, and also alliances between them and secular people. So these are very important developments, which we would not have imagined, before October 7th. So how things are going to develop in the future, I don't know. But what is true is that to the extent that the war on Iran has weakened the U.S. presence in the region to that extent, then I think the people in the region will have more control over their own destiny. And therefore, I think this would have some impact on developments in Israel and Palestine.
So, I mean, I totally agree that there is a need to be idealistic, and there seems like there can be hope. But what do you make of, be it commentators, conspiracy theorists, or maybe people that you know personally? Like, I know some people who feel that perfect harmony is never going to happen because certain demographics of the different religions do believe in, the end of days, the rapture, the Messiah coming, and this is all an inevitable thing that will happen. And all these are shaping up to that, and we can't change destiny. Because when I hear things like that, I'm like, oh my God, is that happening? And what do you make of that? Be it from sociological point of view, religious point of view, or is it just the fringe extremists who are propagating these sort of perspectives?
Well, it's not always. They're not always on the fringe. It depends on where you are, right? If you're in the U.S., then they're certainly not on the fringe. You're talking about Christian Zionists, who are solidly behind Jewish Zionism. In other contexts, in other places, they may be fringe. They may make up fringe elements, but not in the U.S. But basically, this is the problem of religious extremism, whether it's Christian fundamentalism in the form of Christian Zionism, whether it's in the form of Jewish Zionism, or even Muslim Zionism. I'm talking about Muslims who believe in this, division between Israel and Palestine, who are at best silent about Israeli colonization of Palestine, who believe that Iran is the enemy, not Israel, and who believe in strengthening ties with Israel, glossing over the problem of Zionist colonization. So there is such a thing, I think, as Muslim Zionism. So these are the forces that that we need to be aware of and to check. But see, my point is, without any illusions that this is something easy to solve. My point is that the people in the region, talking about the Persian Gulf, Iran, Turkey, the Gulf Arab states, need to be in charge of their own destiny in order to deal with this and other problems, whether economic or political or cultural or religious. They need to be in charge of their own destiny. They don't need to be dominated by American politics, right? How can you have a state thousands of miles away with MAGA or Christian Zionist politicians like Lindsey Graham, egging on the government to go to war in alliance with Israel, to go to war, against Arabs or against Turks or against Iran. It seems like Turkey is supposed to be the next state that Israel needs to tackle. And some Israeli statesmen have said as much. They've said that much that, the next problem after Iran is Turkey. So it's never ending. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Iran, and then Turkey. It's never ending. So when is the region going to be able to, be in charge of its own destiny?
I mean, this morning we were just talking that there have been commentators who have come on our podcast and even predicted that this war with Iran would happen, and it could lead potentially to World War III, right? How worried are you about that possibility or eventuality that it could be a wider regional war or even a nuclear conflict that arises of this?
Yeah, I think that fear is always looming in the background. That if Israel does not succeed in its objectives, it may resort to using what they call tactical nuclear weapons, which I guess means limited nuclear weapons that have a limited effect, which is still something terrible. And that if the conflict continues, there would be more countries getting involved, the Chinese, the Russians, and it would spill over into a global war. That fear is always there. I think I'm less worried now than I was a few days ago, because it seems like there's some conversation between the US and Iran. Seems like countries like Oman and more so Pakistan are playing the role of mediators. So I'm hoping that this will end sooner rather than later. And I think it's partly because the world can't take what is happening. In terms of the economic disruptions, the restrictions for ships going through the Strait of Hormuz is causing a lot of disruption, affecting supply chains, price of oil and natural gas. So hopefully that those economic chokes are going to wake people up to the need for cessation of the war.
So then bringing all that into Singapore, right? You mentioned that the impact of the war is having things on raising prices, not just oil, but all the downstream products. But what about the mindset of individuals, say, Muslims or Jewish people in this part of the world? Do you think there's any spillover or lasting impact in terms of how they view each other, how they view the role of the imperialist, colonialist, small country, big country? What's the impact of that?
I feel there would be a minimal impact, simply because we don't have enough discussion on it, on these issues in Singapore. Open discussions.
Singapore specifically?
Singapore more so than other countries. Because I think there are many restrictions on organizing public discussions, on debates. So many things that I would say need to be clarified in people's minds, many questions that people may have. And there are few opportunities to deal with these questions. For example, if one is inclined to support Iran against America and Israel, some people may feel guilty about supporting Iran because they think, well, supporting Iran means you, let's say if you're a Muslim, it means you're supporting Shiism, which you might think is a problem. Or supporting Iran means that you are anti-Semitic, right? Or supporting Iran means that you are excusing Iranian excesses elsewhere in Yemen or in the past in Syria when it supported a brutal regime. So people have to be able to iron out these contradictions in their minds, and that this ironing out comes from discussion, right? With others. who have similar problems, and from discussion with people who have different perspectives, what one should be able to think that that Iran can be a victim when it is invaded by the US, when it's subject to an imposed war, and at the same time be a perpetrator, as when it violates rights within Iran, when there are and which invites protests from Iranians. One should be able to think that way. So thinking in this nuanced way requires conversation, requires discussion, right? Same thing with regard to Gaza. It doesn't mean that if you are against the Israeli conduct in the war on Palestinians, that you support terrorism. You should be able to be against both terrorism and against the conduct of the Israeli state. But people need a way of thinking, they need a vocabulary to be able to understand all of this, to arrive at that arrive at that logic. What I mean is this: if you say that you are against Israeli war on Gaza, you are then said to be supporting Hamas, and therefore you are supporting terrorism. Now, it is as if there are only two ways to think: be against Israel and therefore be pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist, or be against terrorism and therefore justify Israeli actions. But it's more complicated than that. For example, I would say that Hamas is not a terrorist organization. It doesn't mean that I support what Hamas did, because a liberation movement, an anti-colonial movement, can engage in criminal acts. So we're not supporting that. To the extent that Hamas killed Israeli civilians, that was wrong. But they are, they are a resistance organization. I don't believe that technically it's correct to call them terrorists. For the African National Congress, to me, was not a terrorist organization. It doesn't mean that we don't criticize them for some of the things that they did when they were struggling against apartheid. The same thing goes for Hamas. Now, people can only come to these different ways of thinking and more nuanced ways of thinking if there is discussion.
So, but then how in the countries that you mentioned where there tends to be more discussions, how do those discussions happen? Organically, self-organized, institutionalized?
They happen at all levels. Depending on the on the country. I think in Malaysia, for example, this is happening organically. It's also happening at a more organized level. Palestinian groups, NGOs, research institutes which are based in Malaysia organize these things. Malaysian NGOs organize these things. Groups that are affiliated to the government also organize such sessions. So there's a lot of that going on, and you have I think a full spectrum of ideas that are presented.
And I mean, so do you think the policy in Singapore where, for fear of things going out of control, let's not have these discussions, does more harm than good? Because I also heard in some interview you say you feel there's more of a role for sociologists in a country like Malaysia, where people seem to have a more vested stake in the country improving as opposed to Singapore, where things work. People feel like, it works. Do I need to put in any effort? It'll carry on working. Going back to that question, that approach where, let's not have these difficult conversations because there could be violence, does more harm than good?
I think Singaporeans are sufficiently matured that it's not going to lead to violence. I'm sure it's not going to lead to violence. And Singaporeans are going to have these conversations anyway. But I think it's good for these conversations sometimes to be in the open so that people have the benefit of exposure to these conversations. And that those who have constructive ideas have the opportunity to present these ideas. I don't think that such conversations, if they are in the open, are going to lead to people engaging in a disharmonious manner. For example, we do not want Muslims, for example, to speak in the open and express Judeo-phobic ideas, or for others to express Islamophobic ideas. But we need to speak openly about problems, about Israeli exploitation of Palestinians. And our criticism should not be restricted to Israel. If we're talking about the region, about the Gulf, the Arab world, or the Middle East, there's a lot to be criticized there. The conduct of Arab states, and the same thing goes for Iran. So I think if we are even-handed and fair in our criticisms, in our critique, this makes for good education for the Singapore public.
So, that we're talking about the people, but also for the governments in the Southeast Asia region. Do you think the past month the conflict has changed perceptions about US versus China as a presence in the region, who they should be more aligned with, or thinking about security for themselves in the region? How do you think anything has changed in the perceptions of these two superpowers?
I think over the years, states have come around to the view that they may not express it in public, but they've come around to the view that the US is not a superpower that can be trusted, and that we have to have close relations with other emerging powers, and certainly, China is a power, and I think it's well recognized that China does not have imperialist designs. It is a power which expresses itself more through trade and investment rather than military expansion. China has not been involved in military expansion for centuries, right? And this idea of multipolarity, that it is desirable to move towards a world that is multipolar. BRICS is an expression of that idea. And Iran, I think this also relates to the role of Iran as an anti-imperialist power. The war against Iran and Iran's response is a contribution to the development of multipolarity. For example, one of the views is that in a multipolar world, there should not be the domination of any one currency, such as the US dollar. Now, Iran has contributed in some ways to that idea when the Iranians suggested that ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz should transact in Chinese yuan. That's a very interesting idea. It's not likely that that's going to happen, but it is contributing to planting those ideas. And I think these are things that are going to happen eventually. And that is also partly a reason why the US is so invested in the region, in the Gulf, because it is the source of petrodollars. Right? It's not that the US is dependent on Gulf oil in terms of its consumption. It's not. I think the rest of the world, something like 20% of oil and gas, I believe, flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So many parts of the world are, especially Asia, dependent on that, but not the US. It's more for the petrodollars.
I see.
So de-dollarization is part of decolonization, because it would, it would affect the dominance of the US as a world economic power, and it would contribute to what is called multipolarity.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that we, because I know you were born in Malaysia, but you spent a lot of time in Singapore, right? So I'm sure you understand the Singapore psyche, where for years we grew up with this narrative that we are a small state, So when you talk about decolonization, de-dollarization, and the multipolar world, it still means that there would be superpowers here and there, right? So can a country like Singapore actually afford to be decolonized? Can we afford to? Because to me, when you talk about decolonization, it's almost like, okay, let's see ourselves for who we are, our own ways of thinking, maybe lost traditions. But is that even possible for a country like Singapore?
You asked if Singapore can afford to be decolonized.
Yeah.
I think Singapore and other countries in the region and indeed around the world are already undergoing decolonization. The world is undergoing decolonization. We can't afford to be left out. Singapore cannot afford to be left out. The fact is, America as a dominant power is on decline. No country remains a hegemon forever. In the modern world, the first hegemons were Portugal and Spain. Then you had the British, and then the Americans. The British are no longer a dominant, the central world hegemon. They are no longer that. The Americans are, and the Americans will eventually decline. The question is, will they be taken over by another hegemon, or will it be a more multipolar world? I think it's better for us to live in a multipolar world than to be dominated by the Russians or the Chinese. Whatever happens, there is a role for all states, including small states like Singapore, especially small states like Singapore that, what's the expression? Punch above their
own weight.
Own weight, yeah. That's right. I mean, Singapore has much to contribute in terms of its experience, in terms of governance, in terms of anti-corruption, education, and so many areas. I think it will be, to the extent that we move towards multipolarity, Singapore has the great potential to contribute to that multipolarity.
So across all your teachings, all your research, because I know in your book Applying Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Khaldun, that there was one thing you mentioned in another podcast about how one of his principles or theories is that governments will always be unjust, and there is a role for civic society, right? Are there any other things that you have found in your research that you think is important for not just Singapore, but for people to understand, that maybe hasn't gotten that much attention in the past, about civic society, the role of governments, geopolitics?
Ibn Khaldun said that governments are, as a rule, unjust. And I think he was right. If you look at the history of states, of dynasties, anywhere in the world, not just in the Muslim world, for most of history, people have been ruled by tyrannical governments, whether in the pre-modern world or in the modern world. I think the reason why states or nations or regions or civilizations prospered was in spite of their governments. For example, the so-called Golden Age of Islam, the 10th, 11th centuries, where you had amazing advances in science, in philosophy, in literature, in scientific areas such as mathematics, algebra, geometry, chemistry, physics, optics. This happened while at the same time Muslims were ruled by tyrannical rulers. Now, how could that take place? I think the lesson is that it could take place because the Muslims, the scientists, the philosophers, the thinkers, were not dependent on their governments. For example, institutions of learning the universities in the 10th century in the Arab world were never state institutions. They were the equivalent of what we would call religious endowments, based on religious endowments, waqaf, which is a technical term in Islamic jurisprudence. It's a kind of a commercial instrument. Now, the waqaf is like an endowment which is established by an individual and cannot be disturbed by the state. For example, when a particular individual, he says that, or she, in fact, many of these institutions were established by women, gives money or land and says that this land has to be used in perpetuity as a educational institution, a university. Jamia is as it's said in Arabic, right? This land has to be used as a university, and it is then recorded as such. It becomes enshrined in Islamic law. No government can change that. Right? The government cannot come along later and say that we want to acquire the land and turn it into something else. So many of the institutions, universities, hospitals, some of the first hospitals with wards and all that were established in Baghdad. Many of the institutions were established on the basis of waqaf, of endowments. And they were independent. You could say they were the early forms of civil society. They were independent of the state. They had their own source of revenue and income. And they were not interfered with by the state. They couldn't because of the status of Islamic law. I think that's a lesson for us. So now in the Muslim world, if you just take the example of universities, most universities are state-run, state-owned. And politicians, governments interfere with the running of the universities. They interfere in terms of lack of imposing restrictions. You have a lack of freedom of expression. You have insufficient funding, and so on and so forth. The pre-modern Islamic model was that these institutions are based on waqaf, on endowments, and cannot be interfered with by the state. The state has no say regarding the curriculum, regarding what is taught, regarding the appointment of teachers, of lecturers, of professors. To me, that's an important lesson. That when I think about the Muslim world, it's so dominated by governments, and in most cases corrupt governments, and institutions don't function because they are too dependent on government.
So in Singapore, are we too dependent on government?
One could argue we are, but what is important is that the governments are not corrupt. The government is not corrupt, so the institutions function, right? But to the extent that the government remains the way it is, then the institutions remain functional and effective. But that is something I think important to think of.
I mean, that's a fair point. Because I mean, Singapore, a lot of our policies, the land, the act where the government can take the land, clear land, it's all dependent on a functioning government. But if it falls into the wrong hands, who knows, 20, 50 years down the road. Okay, cool. So if people wanted to find out more about your work, because I know you've written so many books, like where would be a good place for people to go search you out? Do you have a website? Are you active on social media?
Well, I'm shy to admit that I'm active on Facebook because I think it's Facebook is sort of young people don't use Facebook nowadays, right?
Less so,
yeah. I mean, we still use it occasionally.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think I know my kids are on Instagram rather than Facebook. I don't. I've only recently come to even know what Instagram means. So but I'm on Facebook. And I need actually to establish a website for myself. I'm actually in the process of doing that. But I guess the only way is Facebook, and also if they can have an idea of what I write by by Googling me.
Googling you.
Yeah, but it's a good point. I need to be more organized.
Wait, you have a Wikipedia page, so that was helpful. Do you know you have a Wikipedia page?
I do. I think there's some mistakes there. Even my name is spelled wrongly. But yeah,
you need to take charge of your own online presence.
Yeah, because you have written a lot of books. Like if people wanted to find your books, I mean, are they being sold? Like they Google it, they can find it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Google Scholar is a good source. It can, it gives you a good list of what you write.
Okay, cool.
We have one more segment though.
Yeah, the hardest question of all, which is your One Shiok Thing. Which is, So, I mean, it's just something that you have experienced in recent times that you would like to share with our audience. Ideally, not related to what we spoke about. We can go first. So, Terence, you have your One Shiok Thing.
Yeah, I mean, kind of related to what we're talking about. But the astrophysicist scientist Neil deGrasse Tyson, he did a video called A Scientist's View of War, like right after not long after the war broke out, where he really talked about how science has helped governments conduct war, and he talks about the science of missiles and astrophysics of rockets. But at the same time, there are certain things that war also brings to science, like the calculating of what would happen in a nuclear nuclear winter also helped scientists understand or definitively say that our dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteorite hitting Earth, because that's how they kind of modeled out that's what a nuclear winter would look like, and that's probably what dinosaurs went through, and that's why they died. So there is a lot of knowledge that's passed between science and between governments in times of war, but at the same time, rather than advancing as a human species, we seem to be using this knowledge on each other, as opposed to about thinking about what if there is a hostile alien species that comes to attack Earth one day. Maybe that might be the only thing that will unite humans and stop us from attacking each other.
Like in the movies.
In the movies, yeah. So, I mean, it sounds crazy, but it was just a very sobering perspective that, I mean, all this crazy technology we're watching, in the missiles and the drones that they're using, were enabled by, a scientist who just was trying to advance some measure of astrophysics or what as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Mine came about through the YouTube algorithm. I don't know, because of all the videos I've been searching about the Iran war and all, but it was a video by CNA titled Why Singapore Built a 150-meter deep oil cave. So I think I've seen pictures of these oil caves, but it's actually situated in Jurong Island, and it's meant as a store of oil, crude oil, just as a reserve. But what I found interesting was the engineering of it. I think they brought in engineers from around the world, and because it was through a lot of rock, they had to do things like finding out the different rock layers and then putting cement to prevent groundwater from coming in. But not all the groundwater, because they do want some groundwater to seep in so that it's a fully encased a reservoir of oil. And just watching the video, you're like, oh, okay, that's pretty deep, 150 meters.
So that's where we store our
some of our reserves. Or at least that's what's publicly said for that. I'm sure that's not the only store.
This video just came out recently, is it?
I
guess they're trying to assure everyone that we have an oil reserve somewhere.
I don't know how assured I was, but it was an interesting video to watch. Okay, so over to you, Prof. Farid.
Okay, so now I realize that mine is really not as sophisticated as...
no, sometimes ours can be totally...
Yeah. Okay, well, with all these things going on, with the war on Gaza, on Israel, I really get irritated when I come across views expressed by people, including Singaporeans, with views which keep critiquing, dismissing, knocking Iran, Palestine, Hamas, the Iranian leadership, condemning them, but making and of course these people are all subject to criticism. They're not perfect. They do wrong things. But not making any critique of Israel. That really angers me, right? And it always brings me around to this point that the world consists of assholes. Can I say
Yeah,
that?
of course,
Yeah, of course.
You
It's
can
allowed to
swear,
say
you can
it,
say
it's mild,
anything you
it's
want.
mild.
Yeah.
Yeah. And many leaders in the world are assholes, right? And I wonder, how do we define an asshole? See, we all know, we all can identify an asshole when we see one.
Yeah.
But how do you actually define it?
Yeah.
So I looked around, and there is actually a book,
Oh.
a serious book. It's called Assholes.
Oh, really?
Yes. By a philosopher by the name of Aaron James.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So he helps you to,
And
to understand.
You read the book?
I haven't read it yet.
yeah.
I just got it recently.
Oh, okay.
And I'm meaning to read it. But, it's really something that we need to know.
Oh.
Yeah, because, and it's an exercise in concept formation. You know a phenomenon, you can identify it, but you can't quite define it. So this book helps you to do that.
So I mean,
fascinating.
reminds me of another video that we watched previously called Dicks. I think it's like whether you need to be a dick to be successful. So it's a video essay, but I liked it because like what you say, it helps you think about what does someone who behaves in an asshole way actually look like? Because they never teach you that in school.
Yeah.
Maybe they should lah. Maybe they should.
Yeah. It's a very serious topic of study. It was not trivial at all. I mean, this is very important.
It's an academic approach to something that might seem trivial, but no. It's a great One Shiok Thing.
Yeah.
So
Fantastic.
thanks so much for sharing, Prof.
Thank you.
And I mean, hope your family is okay. Hope this war ends soon. And really appreciate all the perspectives you have shared because us and our listeners, we're just trying to make sense of what's happening.
Yeah. And
so-
basically decolonize our captive minds.
Yeah,
right?
correct.
That's an important thing.
Yeah. So Terence, how do you like that conversation with Professor Farid?
I thought it was fascinating, man.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many perspectives about Iran, Iranian people, the governments, and the whole region of the Middle East that I thought we've been consuming so much about it in the last month, right? There's so many new things I learned listening to him.
Yeah, and I mean, as much as like when I first saw his profile as a sociologist, I mean, I did think, okay, he's going to bring that perspective to it. But if you look at all the books he's written, I mean, he's really a big believer of decolonization, studying the great philosophers that are non-Western from the past. His wife is Iranian. He has family in Iran.
Yeah.
So listening to him, I'm like, oh shit, this is what I've been looking for, man.
Yeah.
And I'm super appreciative that he came on and was very, very honest to anything we asked him.
Yeah, and I like that, because he's situated here. I mean, he's Malaysian, but, has lived in Singapore. He can really talk about the Southeast Asian perspective and all this, and how the governments will be thinking about everything that's going on vis-a-vis like US versus China. And then he boils it down to the individual and how people like you have a very neo-colonial mindset when it comes to examining everything.
When did that come up?
We were talking about neo-colonialism. Right? Yeah. And just the fact that we went to US University and we got
watched Friends,
and then
Simpsons.
BBC, CNN, even my One Shiok Thing was Neil deGrasse Tyson, American scientists, all. Yeah.
But I mean, I know, certain things he said, I was like, wow, I know people might take this out of context and say he's a terrorist apologist and all that. But I appreciated the fact that he said we need to be fair in critiquing every stakeholder.
Yeah.
Not just Israel, not just US, but also the Gulf states, and just like Muslims and across the board.
Yeah.
Which I thought was like, it's rare to hear that because people will always jump the gun.
Yeah.
Even in this case, they might take out certain excerpts. I know they might be certain excerpts taken out and put out of context, but the fact that there's that whole long conversation, I think it was very, very helpful.
And he made a good point about the discovery of America.
Yeah, correct.
Because if you even think about it in Singapore, like the founding of modern Singapore, we talk about that and we lionize like Raffles, right? I mean, Raffles Institution, Raffles this, Raffles that. But I think, in the past 1-2 decades, there's been a lot more reckoning, right, of what colonialism and its history meant for Singapore and other countries in the region also.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that, there's a lot more studying or at least a lot more literature about all this going on.
Yeah, and I mean, it was only when we did a 𝗪𝗪 episode about the history of Singapore that I realized, actually, from the 1200s, 1300s, Singapore has a damn rich history.
Yeah.
Almost like a Game of Thrones level history of changing leadership and all that.
Yeah. Or even the Singapore Stone, when you talked about it, it just blew my mind that, that there's this relic that predates our colonial past, right?
Yeah. And I mean, his father, like one thing I didn't get a chance to ask when you talk about, the example of Sir Stamford Raffles, right?
Yeah.
His father literally wrote a book called Thomas Stamford Raffles, Schemer or Reformer, where he challenged the notion that Raffles was actually someone who, helped to discover Singapore, because we were there.
Yeah.
Right. We were never founded in 1819. We existed before that.
Yeah.
So it's just, now I'm going to throw in like decolonization of the mind. I think that he's used the term captive mind also.
Captive mind,
captive mind. So, wow, damn interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think I do want to read at least one of his books. And like for everyone listening, hopefully you found that useful. We're going to put all the links to his Facebook page in the description. We will definitely be sharing shorter excerpts from this conversation, which you can also see on social media. So you can follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, and Telegram. And if you want a weekly newsletter with all our One Shiok Things, you can sign up for your little bit at 𝗪𝗲𝗏�com.
And if you want to work with us, please email us at contact@ministryoffunny.com, or just check out ministryoffunny.com. That's our website with contact us page there as well.
Sweet. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll talk to you all soon.